Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of BigFoot Girl Talks. I'm Amy Mercury, the Bigfoot Girl as it were, and since today is Valentine's Day, per Quinn's suggestion, we're going to be doing something a bit different from my typical review of Bigfoot-themed books and movies. So I'm going to be calling this episode My Beastly Valentine, a Monster Romance Primer. If you know anything about me, you know that I am an avid connoisseur of monster-themed romances. So, I'm going to spend this episode talking to you about some monster romance stories I've read recently that I want to recommend to you guys to check out. As well as getting a bit philosophical and talking about what monster romance is, what it means, and really what the image of the monster himself represents in media. I'm going to start by talking to you about how I think what got me into monster romance. And let's flash back to about circa 1991. Yeah, that sounds about right. Circa 1991, when Disney's Beauty and the Beast first came out. I was about 6 years old, so I guess prime age to see that. And my parents took me to see it in the theater. And like anybody around that time, I loved the movie. I still love the movie. But I had one problem with it. And my parents asked me after we got out of the film, what did you think about it? Did you like it? And I said, well, I liked it, except for one part. And they're like, well, what's that? Well, I didn't like that the Beast turned into a prince at the end. I thought he looked better as the Beast. He was way more fun. And my parents were absolutely shocked. They're like, what do you mean? He was a beast. He was big and hairy and ugly and messy. And I was like... So, from that, I think that really sort of kind of marked the beginning of my love of monster romances. And looking back throughout most of my life, some of my biggest fictional crushes were usually on monsters. Go a little bit later, I liked Goliath from Disney's Gargoyles. A little bit later than that, I liked Quasimodo from Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I always had a kind of a weakness for horror movie monsters. Like, I felt bad for the Frankenstein monster. I felt bad for the creature from the Black Lagoon, the Wolfman, all of these creatures from all these classic films that we're not supposed to feel sorry for, we're not supposed to be empathetic towards, but I always really like them. And, it made me sad even when the monster in so many of these stories kind of got the girl for a little bit. It always ended in crippling tragedy, or at least they couldn't stay together for whatever reason. Fast forward to today, and my feelings about monsters haven't really changed much. And if the success of Guillermo del Toro's film, The Shape of Water is any indication, then it's something that's becoming much more acceptable. I love them more now probably than ever, and I spend an awful lot of time seeking out monster romance for my own purpose. One could say that I am absolutely obsessed with monster romance. I don't know where they got that idea. Seriously. It's all a mystery. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk to you about a handful of monster romances that I've read recently. All of the titles I'm about to talk about can be found on Amazon Kindle, so if you have the Kindle app, I recommend looking them up. If you don't have the Kindle app, I highly suggest downloading it. There's such a great wealth of books and stuff you can find on there. So the first one I'm going to talk about is one called The Lady and the Orc by Finley Finn. Now, I haven't really read anything else by this author, and I just kind of stumbled upon this book while, no shame, looking for orc romances. I've read a handful of orc romances over the years. Most of them are short stories, so I was really excited to find a full-length novel. And this one did not disappoint from beginning to end. It, takes place in your typical fantasy setting, but we have our main character who is... Hang on. What's her name again? Can't remember her name right now. Whoops. Jewel. So Jewel is our main character. She is a married noblewoman, and her husband is kind of a dick. who is never really around much, and apparently they've been trying to have a baby for the past couple of years, and she just can't seem to conceive. And of course, you know, her husband blames it on her. She's not in a very good place. But her husband is off somewhere to, you know, do nobleman stuff, and he takes all the guards for his estate with him, leaving his wife, Jewel, and pretty much everybody in the house completely unguarded while he's gone. Meanwhile, you've got a raiding band of orcs that have been rumored to be going around the countryside just looting and pillaging and all that. So our main character is really worried that something's going to happen. And because it's fantasy, it does. They get raided by a band of orcs. And the Orc King decides to kidnap her and take her back to the orc encampment, which is basically the orcs live in this mountain that they've kind of dug holes into, living sort of in a subterranean environment. And at first you're not really sure what to think of the main guy character. His name is Grimmar, for reference. And, you know, he's very brutish, typical orc character. So to give you a little bit of a backstory here, the orcs in this world are only male, by the way. There are no female orcs, apparently. So the only way for orcs to breed is by getting with human women. And I will say this is my only criticism of the book. This is where it stops, is that I think it's a little weird that, and frankly impossible, that there can be a species that only produces males. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And, you know, they're never going to be like half orcs, they're just going to be orc. But you know what? It's fantasy, okay? Like, I can suspend disbelief long enough to enjoy the rest of it, because the rest of it is awesome. Our Orc King, Grimmar, kidnaps our main character, Jewel, and takes her back to the Orc City. And at first, you know, it's tense. They don't really like each other that much, but he does explain to her that he has kidnapped her to, you know, basically make him his wife, to breed with her, and to make more orcs. And somehow throughout all of this, though, because it's a romance, they do end up falling in love. We soon learn, however, that a lot of Grimmar's motivations here is that he's trying to unite all of the orcs. There are various orc tribes throughout the world, and he feels that if he takes a human wife and mates with her, that's going to show his dominance, and he's going to have more influence over the other orcs. It's tough to see how in this situation the two characters, I guess when I'm just describing it this way, how these two characters are going to fall in love. But they do find a tenderness for one another. You do understand, like, because the orcs in this world are very much oppressed by the humans. They're not really, like, even allowed to, like, leave their place to go out. And they are denied pretty much any other rights that anybody else in the kingdom would have. They, you know, can't even, like, keep livestock. They can't trade. They can't do anything. Humans just kill them on sight. So you do kind of understand that it would be a little bit hard to get a date in this situation. And I'd like to stress that there is no point in this story where there's any violation of consent. You know, the character Jewel does want it. You know, Grimmar is actually not some horrible monster. But the two characters have a lot of things to work out. And I'd also like to stress that our main character of Jewel, she, in her old life with her former husband, she often felt very trapped. Sure, there wasn't much she could do. Basically, when she got married to him, he took over her family fortune, so she can't even really say no to him. But she finds that in living with the orcs, that she actually has far more freedom than she ever did in her old life. And I like that because I feel that it gives a sort of slight power dynamic element to the story that I think is always present in that sort of genre of orc romance. And I'll get to that, what I feel like, you know, the kind of the main tropes of orc romance are in a minute. But and I feel like that's something that is always kind of present but isn't played upon enough. So that's one of the reasons I really liked it. I also thought the writer herself, her language was very good. I find it easy to empathize with the characters in the story. I think the dialogue's very natural for it being a fantasy story. And honestly, it kept me engaged all the way through. I could barely put it down. And as far as like what an orc romance like, what are some of the common tropes of that? I think it's almost always that the girl is being kidnapped and taken away. There is often an element of, the orc is usually very a dominant male. He's often like a leader of his tribe. There's breeding kink in it, which is very common in orc stories. I think the first like orc romance I ever read was very big into the breeding kink as well. So that's The Lady and the Orc by Finley Finn. I totally suggest if you like orc romance or if you like monster romance in general, to give it a read. So on the topic of orc romance, I'm going to talk briefly about another one that I read that I recommend. I thought it was a lot of fun. This one is called The Orc Wife by S.J. Sanders. I've read a couple of things by her, and I'm going to talk about them in this segment as well. And I really like her writing style. It's fun, it's humorous, but it's still being, it's light, but it's still serious at times as well. So I feel like she's got a good tone to her work. The Orc Wife I like because, admittedly, I'm kind of got a soft spot for that, they call it isekai, where in anime, where somebody from the modern contemporary world goes to a fantasy world, which is what you got here. Sammy, our main character, was supposed to be going out up in the mountains to have a romantic getaway for the weekend with her boyfriend. But she goes up to this mountain in the hills, there's a horrible snowstorm, and her boyfriend calls to cancel out on her and says he's not going to show up. So she's stuck there for a week, and she gets snowed in and she can't even get out. The electricity goes out and she's only got a fireplace to keep herself warm. So she goes out into the frozen tundra to gather some twigs and light a fire, but ends up getting so cold and lost that she passes out. Well, along comes our leading male character, Orgath. Now, this is supposed to take place in the modern contemporary world, but apparently in this setting, the fantasy world kind of exists alongside our own, and people are occasionally allowed to go from the fantasy world into our world as long as they're quiet and discreet about it. So our character Orgath is traveling through our modern world, off in the frozen wastelands, and he happens to find Sammy passed out in the snow. So he picks her up and decides to take her back to his world. Problem with this being, though, is he can't exactly let her go back at this point for a number of reasons. For one thing, people in the contemporary world aren't supposed to know about this world at all, so he can't let her go back and let her blab. And frankly, there's not exactly a very good spot to let her out at. It could be back in this frozen wasteland, and it would not be convenient anyway. She's understandably a little upset about this at first, but tries to accept her life living with Orgath. We find that Orgath had at one point been in line to be a chieftain of this orc tribe that we encounter. But he'd had the title stripped away from him some years earlier when another person came into power. So, but at first you could tell he doesn't want anything to do with it. He's fine just kind of living as a hermit out in the, out by himself. Sammy, however, starts to develop a certain fondness for Orgath. He develops a fondness for her, and the two of them fall in love, despite all their differences. But she comes to find out that she's really, her life here, living in this fantasy realm, is actually much better than the life she had before. And I'm not going to give too much of the story away, but I do find that it's really interesting that they have two worlds kind of existing alongside each other. And it's interesting because most of the orc romances I've read have taken place like all in fantasy, and so you already have a main character with preconceived notions about what an orc is, versus in this case Sammy doesn't really know anything about orcs. She wasn't necessarily a geek or anything like that, so she doesn't even have that kind of background. So I think she serves a very nice analog to the rest of the story. But I like the characters. I think that they're well developed and well rounded overall, and I like S.J. Sanders' writing style. Like I said, it's humorous, it's fun, lighthearted, but still gets pretty serious sometimes. Another thing she wrote was called The Lantern. It was basically like a short story, and I really wish I would have read this around Halloween, because that's when the story takes place, and I feel like the mood of the story is just, she really kind of captures that kind of spooky, but yet, well, I wouldn't even say spooky, that eerie side of Halloween, that romanticized element of Halloween. In the story, our main character, it's Halloween night, and she kind of got dragged out to a party with a bunch of friends that she didn't really want to go to. So she's walking home that night alone by herself. She talks a lot about her dad in this story, the main character that is. And I think we're kind of led to believe that her father died rather recently, but he was a guy who was really big into Halloween. And ever since then, like, the magic of Halloween's kind of been lost to her. So she's walking by herself, and all of a sudden the wind picks up and she feels something whirling behind her, and then she turns around and there's this big like opening in space and time of this creature that if I had to pick what this creature is supposed to be, because she never really says, which I think makes it even more fun, but basically, have you ever heard of a Wendigo? Or Wendigo, some kind of big fae-like creature, sometimes with like a big like animal skull atop his head, antlers. Basically that's what it is, some sort of fae creature, kind of creepy, but nevertheless very alluring. And he, seduces her and takes her back into his world, and she kind of passes out in the process, and she wakes up and she, wants to know where she is, and he basically tells her that every year on Halloween night he takes a woman from the contemporary world to live with him for 1 year. They live in this lush fae-like garden. Everything's blooming. It's basically spring for an entire year, and there's all kinds of magical creatures, and it's kind of heavenly. He brings a woman to live with him for like a year, and at the end of the year she can decide if she wants to continue to stay with him or not, and continue to be basically his like fairy queen. So it was a really interesting take on a Halloween story, because it combines this sort of magic and fae without it being like a traditional monster. It's not a very long read. Like I said, it is a short story, but it is entertaining, it is different, and props for having like a monster with unconventional parts, if you know what I'm getting. So yeah, totally give it a read. Fun story. And now we're gonna get back to my roots somewhat, and that is Beauty and the Beast. What started it all on this, monster romance journey for me. It's called Gilded Rose, and it gets a lot of props from me because it's kind of a dark version of Beauty and the Beast, which I haven't seen as much of as I think I would like. The main character, Amisha, lives with her father in this little town. He's like a tinkerer. She's very well-read, very bright character. But, the beginning of the story opens with the fact that their town is basically being attacked by these gargoyle-like monsters. And Amisha has to make a very difficult decision for the town with how to kind of get them out of there. Eventually, however, she escapes this town and goes off into the countryside, where she comes across this chateau that looks kind of abandoned. But when she gets inside, she realizes that it's not abandoned at all. In fact, this is kind of headquarters for our leading male character, who is the Beast, and he kind of looks like a giant gargoyle, so I think that's kind of awesome. He is basically like the big villain. He is responsible for why Amisha's town was under attack. He goes throughout the countryside sending his minions to kidnap people, take them back to his lair, and he turns them into gargoyle-like creatures as well. big part of the first, half of the story is her, like, kind of existing within the walls of the chateau among the old servants' quarters trying to hide. And it is very creepy, and I do like that element of it. However, I did feel like the second half seemed a little bit rushed. I didn't find the romance as believable as I would have with a lot of other Beauty and the Beast takes. I don't feel like they really got a chance to know each other and then suddenly, oh, they're in love. That kind of doesn't, that's the reason why it doesn't quite get an A+ for me. But I still give her mad props for a lot of the description of why he became a beast. And for, well, the real villains of the story, which are basically described as alchemists, and they are the ones responsible here for why he got turned into this gargoyle-like beast. It's a very interesting take. Emma Hamm is the creator of it. I like some of her other works, like Heart of the Fae, which is also sort of a Beauty and the Beast story, but gives it kind of a different edge. So there's apparently going to be a whole series of the Gilded Rose books. The next one is called Emerald Rose, and it doesn't come out until March. So I might give this one a try, because I feel like in the first one, even if I feel like the second half fell a little flat, I do feel like she was kind of opening it up for this greater plot overall. So I'm gonna read the second one and then maybe give you guys a review about that later, but and see if it kind of changes my overall feeling of it. But I do think it's worth a read, because I feel like Emma Hamm's a very good writer. And now it's time for me to give a shameless little plug for my personal monster romance, Orc Girl. Orc Girl is my orc and human romance comic. It actually had started out as a novel, but in the past 2 years, I've developed it into a comic series. Orc Girl is kind of a culmination of a lot of different things that I've really wanted to see, not just in monster romance, but in fiction in general. I definitely wanted a romance between a monster and a human where the monster didn't become human at the end. So, little spoilers there. But if you're reading Orc Girl, I think you're going to figure that out already. Also, I wanted a fantasy story that was written for somebody a little bit older. Like, one kind of pet peeve I have about so much fantasy is it seems to, your main characters, especially if they're female, tend to be like 18, 19 years old in a lot of their stories, maybe even younger. And so while I still enjoy the stories, I don't feel like I can connect with the main character as much. So I've never stopped liking fantasy, I've never stopped liking romances, but on the other hand, though, it would be nice to read one about somebody who is going through the similar problems that I have for somebody my age, somebody in their late 20s to early 30s. Seeing that there wasn't much like that out there, I set about writing Orc Girl. I've always had a thing for orcs. They've been my favorite fantasy race since I played an orc about over 10 years ago in my first D&D campaign in college. So orcs have always had kind of a soft spot for me. Jenny is my main character. She's 29, and she had just broken up with a boyfriend about a year ago. We don't know exactly the story just yet. Well, I do, but you guys don't. But we do seem to know that it was her that made the decision to break things off, and she's feeling a little bit raw about it. You can also tell she's not terribly happy with her life. She's working at a bank, just kind of trying to live one day at a time. She reads romance novels, not that I know anything about that, and basically dreams of a better life for herself. She's been having these weird episodes where she finds herself in a strange place, something that is nothing like she's seen in her daily life. And she's been going to doctors wanting to know what this is, but nobody has an answer for her. Until one night she goes to sleep and wakes up and finds she actually is in another world. And she's not there for very long before she is found and kidnapped by a band of mercenaries who intend to sell her off. And while she's hoping this is some big bad dream, unfortunately it's not. She is in another world, and this is what's happening to her. However, within a few days, she is rescued, or so she thinks, by a raiding band of orcs. Now, she's here chained to a wagon, unable to get out, and she is approached by who she finds out is the Orc King, Vargan, who says to her, I will give you a choice. I can either cut your chain and let you wander free in the woods, however, you're here in the dark woods all by yourself, or I can cut your chain and offer you shelter, food, and a life of comfort, but you have to surrender to me as my human pet. So, of course, she hesitantly makes the second choice and goes off with him to be his human pet, which currently in the comic is about where we're at. We're slowly learning exactly what being a human pet means. This is basically, I think, the project I've always wanted to work on. I have had a number of comic projects I've done over the years, but this is the first one I've taken very seriously and looked at professionally. But to have some big kind of epic fantasy story with a monstrous leading male and, our leading female who is has a long list of flaws, trying to work through them. Also, I've always wanted to create a story that explores the concept of good and evil. I think a lot of people make this mistake that good and evil are very clearly drawn things, and I don't really think that's the case. Certainly some things in life are strictly good or evil, but I don't think most things are. I think that ethics is very much a gray scale, and I think that in life there's not a whole lot of just good or bad people. There's a lot of good people that sometimes do bad things. And so in trying to, and while that is one of the big themes of my story, I felt like the orcs worked very well for that, as orcs and monsters in general are usually portrayed as the bad guy. And a big thing for me, something I always, loved about monsters is that, well, maybe they may seem bad, but I don't think they really are. That was the true allure of the monster for me, is that, well, are they really bad, or do you just not understand them? Are they bad, or are they just hurting? What makes the monster behave the way he does? Because I don't think monsters are born, I think that they are made. So if you'd like to read Orc Girl, I will put the link down in the description. It's my personal website is orcgirl.com. You can also read Orc Girl on Tapas and on Webtoon as well. So I'll make sure all the links are put down in the description so you guys can check that out. So whether you're into monster romance or not, if you get a chance to give it a read, please do. It is a project very dear to my heart, and I appreciate Quinn very much for letting me shamelessly plug my work on her channel. So I think in talking about Orc Girl, it kind of brings me back to what I was saying at the beginning of this video about the philosophy of the monster romance. What makes a monster, what does the monster represent? And I kind of brushed upon it a little bit ago in talking about, well, what makes a monster tick? Are they really evil? Are they really bad? Or are people just not understand them? Monsters speak to the weird, unaccepted parts of all of us. Those of us who were weird, strange, and basically not accepted by people around us. I think that we find refuge in monsters. And I think why a monster romance is so important is that a lot of times when you read romances, I feel like the people are too perfect. And I love romances, don't get me wrong. But sometimes the guy is too perfect. Sometimes the girl is just like, I'm like, what's wrong with her, okay? Or she's either too plain or not plain at all. And it's easy to see why the guy is into her. But I think in monster romance, so often what we see is very flawed heroines that have a lot of problems, a lot of baggage, a lot of things that they want to work towards, which to me is a much more realistic interpretation of people as a whole. And when these heroines find their monster, that monster looks at them, and it's not that they only tolerate that they're flaws. They see these flaws, they accept them, and they find them valuable when the rest of society rejected them for these flaws. Take, for instance, The Shape of Water. our main character, she is mute, she cannot speak. But our main monster character, well, he can't exactly speak either. But the two of them are still able to communicate with one another through body language. And the monster doesn't see her inability to speak, that she is mute, as a flaw at all. He just accepts it and finds value in it. In the case of S.J. Sanders' Orc wife, our orc character, Grimmar, finds Sammy's kind of hot-heated temper and her obstinance to be very attractive and something sort of orc-like, which her ex-boyfriend didn't like at all about her. Or if we're referencing Beauty and the Beast, whether we're talking about the Disney version or Gilded Rose, like I just spoke of a little bit ago, the fact that the main character, the Beauty, is very intelligent actually helps a lot. And whereas she was often ostracized for her love of books and made to feel kind of like the odd one out, the Beast finds value in it. It's something that they can not only connect with, but in the case of like Gilded Rose, her ability to research and process information so well is ultimately what helps the Beast in that story break his curse. I guess at the core of monster romance is it gives a feeling of belonging to everybody who feels like they don't belong anywhere. That even if the rest of society doesn't accept me, this person does. And it's not just that they accept it, they don't just tolerate the flaws, they love them for their flaws and don't even see them as flaws. So I think that in monster romance, they say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I don't think that that just applies to the monster himself, of seeing past his flaws and his looks per se. I think that it also applies to the heroines of the story as well, where our beastly character is looking past her flaws and seeing the beauty in them as well. I think monsters are really representations of ourselves, of a mixture of good and bad qualities all put together, the things that make us feel so separate from the rest of society. But when you really sit down and talk to people, you realize that everybody has flaws, everybody has problems, but they don't always want to talk about them. And I think that for a monster, rather than being able to hide all those flaws, they're very clearly represented right in front in a visual way. There's no hiding, there's no playing of games. It's just bearing your flaws for the whole world and being completely unable to hide them. And I think these days people feel very uncomfortable with dating. I mean, dating is kind of a difficult thing, I think, especially in the digital age, where so easily people can put on a facade and then you meet them and they are absolutely nothing like what they depicted themselves as online. Having that sort of blatant honesty of character flaws and who this person really is, I think that there's some value in that to people today. So that is monster romance. I hope I can do another one of these sections because I got plenty more monster romances I could talk about, but I felt this was a nice variety for Valentine's Day. And if you like these videos, everybody, make sure that you hit the like button and subscribe. Just smash that subscribe button and hit the little bell in the corner there so you can get notifications every time a new video is uploaded. I'd also like to take another moment to thank Quinn yet again for letting me do this segment and for shamelessly plugging my own stuff as well. Guys, if you are waiting to have your beastly Valentine, I hope that very much that you find it and get to spend a monstrously good time together. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. Bye, and have a good one. Mwah!